Now, staying here in France, Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne has given ministers and their staff until the 8th of December to delete messaging apps like WhatsApp and Signal, citing cybersecurity concerns. She's told them to download instead a little known French alternative called Olvid. I'm now joined on set by the president of Signal, Meredith Whitaker, as well as by France 24's technology editor, Peter O'Brien. Peter, take us back on what's happened exactly. Where does this? What is the context for this announcement?
Yeah, so my counterpart on the French channel, Guillaume Calais, got the scoop yesterday. Essentially, the memo doesn't actually mention Signal or WhatsApp specifically, but it does tell government officials, cabinets, their team to get rid of the most popular messaging apps, saying that they're, quote, not devoid of security flaws. Now, I can tell you that Signal and WhatsApp are the go-to apps for these ministers and their teams. And Olvid, developed by a small French startup, is to be used, says Borne, alongside Chat, which is another app developed by the French government for use in government circles. So Meredith Whitaker, president of the Signal Foundation, then tweeted saying that what was in the memo was dangerously misleading. So is the French government purely playing politics, or does Signal really have security flaws?
Well, I can't speak to the French government, and I think it is reasonable and normal for a government to assess and choose the tools that work for them. So my issue is not with choosing an app that seems to have been created by intelligent and interesting people doing something interesting. It's with the implication that the rationale for that choice was based on security flaws, which is, of course, a very serious allegation when it comes to an app like Signal that goes out of our way to set the gold standard for privacy and security. We are open source, we're independently audited, and our cryptographic technologies that power WhatsApp and power a whole host of secure messaging technologies outside of Signal are also audited and have been tried and tested over a decade. So it's very important that we are clear when we communicate the protections that Signal can provide, and that we recognize that people use these apps in very high stakes situations where leaking their communications, whether it's a journalist with a source or human rights defenders, can be an issue of life or death. So in the industry, in the tech industry where I'm situated, we have processes for what we call responsible disclosure. And when there is a security flaw or a vulnerability, there are practices whereby you notify the developers of a given app or platform. You give them time to fix that so that you're not announcing a vulnerability that will then be exploited by hackers. And then after it's fixed, you can announce it, you can let people know, maybe download a new version. But we have that type of rigorous practice because these statements are so powerful and because they shape behavior.
I mean, from what I understand, the sort of the belief behind something like Olvid being more secure than Signal is because Signal still relies on mobile phone numbers. I think this was something that you were planning to give the option not to use, but as it stands, Olvid, you simply share a code with someone, and the idea is that this provides you more security and you're not vulnerable to attacks using mobile phone numbers.
Well, look, I have no idea what the assertion of, security for Olvid or concerns around security for any host of others, right? What I saw was a portion of a leaked memo. I don't know the criteria for assessment, and I'm sure there are different criteria, right? In InfoSec and the security world, we have a concept of a threat model, right? So the type of security you need depends on what you're afraid of, the types of hacks or vulnerabilities that may be most threatening to you, what the stakes of your communication are. But I don't think that we can consider use of a phone number as an identifier, which is important both for ensuring the authenticity of your contacts. So you're not speaking with someone pretending to be Meredith, but who really isn't Meredith, which can be a significant security flaw in some threat models. And it's important for protecting from spam accounts. So you don't want to enable someone to spin up 1,000 accounts that then pollute the network and ultimately render it unusable. So, that would not be considered a security flaw or vulnerability in the language of information security. A security flaw or a vulnerability is something that, can be exploited or something that seriously undermines the promises of a given service or application. So what I see here could very well be a collapse of language, but nonetheless, there are very high stakes to that collapse of language. And again, I think, I'm looking forward to talking more with the government, to understanding their certification process. Again, I think it is healthy to have a practice of scrutinizing and examining these services, but we also need to be very careful, particularly with official assertions that cast aspersions on apps like Signal, which do set the gold standard for security and privacy in the industry.
Now, there's also this fear about backdoors and regulators or security services having a way into apps that we use. With the UK, you've said that Signal could well pull out of the UK were it to come about that the online safety bill created an environment that would then allow regulators access to Signal apps, even if they're saying, well, that's because we need to look for illegal content and clamp down on it. Now, here in France, Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin has again floated this idea of potentially giving security services a backdoor to apps like Signal in order to crack down on, for instance, extremism. Would you pull out of France if you were asked to provide this backdoor?
Look, our principles and positions do not change based on jurisdiction. Our commitment is to providing a meaningfully private communications app. And to do that, we need to rely on strong end-to-end encryption. And the fact of the matter, established for decades through expert consensus and reestablished over and over again, is there's no such thing as a safe backdoor. If you build a backdoor that the security services can get into, hackers can access it, adversaries can access it, hostile nation states can access it. So this really is a zero-sum issue. And it's a zero-sum issue not because the technological community and the expert community has some sort of radical position that they have decided on. It's a zero-sum issue because that's how the math works. If you break these systems, if you break these encryption protocols, you have broken the privacy guarantees that system is able to offer in the presence of strong encryption. And so what we're talking about when we talk about backdoors, and this has been true since the 90s, this is true every 5 years when another law enforcement agency or government has the wish of a magical backdoor, is that you can't do it safely. You undermine core infrastructures that, confidential communications, financial networks, and other, incredibly important services rely on when you build these backdoors.
Now, you're also an important advocate for ethics in artificial intelligence. You're the chief advisor of the AI Now Institute, which you co-founded in 2017 while you were still at Google. Now, of course, we're seeing the most important bit of AI regulation to date reach its final stages next Wednesday. It's the final negotiation in the EU over the AI Act. And now we're seeing this last-minute push by France, Germany, Italy to replace the regulation of these broad, powerful AI models like GPT with codes of conduct. So what do you think of this?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the procedural details of the AI Act or the specific positions being taken by different European governments, simply because I am not across that. My day-to-day work is very much focused on Signal. But I do think that, I can safely say, as someone who's been in tech for almost 20 years, that I've never seen a code of conduct capable of holding these large monopolies accountable. And I think we need to recognize that the heart of the AI industry is this monopoly concentration of power in the hands of a handful of companies, largely based in the US and China.
And one outcome of these negotiations next week, Politico's Mark Scott is reporting that we might see a kind of model that frames US AI giants as posing a systemic risk and therefore regulated, while smaller European players sort of dodge the regulation, if you will. Do you see this as a viable outcome?
Well, there's a bit of complexity here that I'll try to unpack quickly. So right now, the players with the resources, the ingredients needed to create these large-scale AI models are based in the US and again in China, but in this context, we're really talking about the US. These are the tech companies that have established infrastructural dominance, so the massive server infrastructures distributed across the globe. They have massive amounts of data, and they have the market reach to distribute and use these large-scale AI algorithms in profitable ways. And there are only about 5 of these companies. So yes, there are startups surrounding these companies that license their infrastructure, that license their IP for different deployment, that reskin GPT after they have, licensed GPT from Microsoft to create a product that uses that on the back end. So there are a lot of startups, but there are no startups that have the necessary ingredients to meaningfully compete on the same terms with these giants. And so when we talk about these regulatory moves, we really need to realize again that this large scale AI is a product of this concentration of power. It requires huge amounts of server, huge amounts of data, and this sort of market dominance. And that, we can create new prototypes, we can create new models, but ultimately we need to realize that those are reliant on these resources. We're licensing them, or we're finding ways to avail ourselves of them, like OpenAI did with Microsoft to get access to their Azure compute. And if we're going to tackle some of the problems that AI raises, we need to center tackling this concentration of power.
All right, Meredith Whittaker, thanks so much for your answers.
I have a
Yes,
quick
go-
question
go
for
on,
Meredith.
Shona,
This is
go
a
on.
really fascinating
Yeah.
conversation. I mean, we're all on the internet. We're all using apps like WhatsApp, and they've made my family's life a lot easier. We're spread out around the world. But it seems to me that one of the core issues of this debate is really kind of putting, I guess, to say it broadly, technology on one side and governments on the other, and who has access to the technology and who controls it. I mean, we've seen Mark Zuckerberg in the U.S. Testifying to Congress. This kind of control over who decides what gets done. It seems like we're really in the thick of that debate even now. How do you see this debate playing out? Who's going to win?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a psychic, but I would say we are seeing that debate play out maybe 30 years late. And we have, these companies and these norms have had a lot of time to establish themselves, in the US context with almost no guardrails. So what we're dealing with is sort of entrenched infrastructures, entrenched business models that rely on surveillance and the monetizing of personal data to sell to advertisers, to train AI models, and a structure that actually needs to be examined and, in my view, dismantled at least somewhat if we're going to regain that balance of power. Because of course we can talk about one jurisdiction starting let's say a European cloud or a French cloud architecture. But what that doesn't do is mimic the global reach of these mega companies and actually compete on the scale that they're competing with their locked-in network effects and their large platforms that are already providing core infrastructure across the globe for our lives and institutions.
But that are actually bigger than government in many ways.
Well, as measured on some axes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on set, Meredith Whittaker. Fascinating discussion on AI and, of course, apps like Signal. Thank you so much for joining us.